Ending free movement was the wrong move for the UK, yet it was the move the people of the nation decided upon. Ending free movement was one of the key campaign points presented by the Leave Group in 2016, when it urged Britons to vote to leave the European Union. The Leave Group argued that free movement had caused an undue strain on UK's economy, and based on the UK's membership in the EU, there was nothing they could do about it. Concurrently, the Remain group wasn't largely in favour of the unprecedented number of migrants entering the country via the free movement channels either, although they weren't outright against it. If anything, immigration might have been one facet both feuding groups agreed on. There had to be a change. For the Leave Group, this change meant withdrawal from the EU. For the Remain group, this change meant renegotiating terms with the EU. We all know which side won, with a slight but undeniable majority in the end. But was ending free movement the right move? That's what we're here to explore. In 2016, it was the Treasury, the International Monetary Fund, and the Organisation for Economic Trade and Cooperation on one side, and 8 economists who became known as Economists for Brexit on the other. The debate was on, unsurprisingly, the economic consequences of Brexit. With less than a month left for the referendum that would decide it all, economists from within the United Kingdom and all over the world poured in their expertise. You have to remember that the UK was about to end a near 50-year relationship with the European Union, the largest socio-economic and oft-political union in Europe. Naturally, a lot of questions arose, namely, is this the right move for Britain? According to the Economists for Brexit, yes, it was. They countered the Treasury report, which suggested that unemployment would reach new highs and how trade barriers would impact the country's GDP. Patrick Minford, one of the 8 economists for the Leave Group, proposed his own model, which suggested that not only was the Treasury model flawed, but also elaborated how Britain would thrive in a post-Brexit economy. Minford said output would be 2% higher by the end of the decade, Britain would be 5% more competitive on global markets, and real wages would be 1.5% higher than if the UK remained in the EU. Needless to say that the actual output was far different. In fact, per 2024's Aston report, the UK's economy suffered tremendously in the aftermath of Brexit and would require several years of recuperating to bring back to pre-Brexit levels. And the explosive claims of the Leave Group were brought into question. Another member of the Economists for Brexit was Roger Bootle, who argued that the EU's economic record had been very poor compared to developed nations. This was because of a variety of reasons, namely reduced efficiency of the euro, regulatory burdens, and misuse of EU funding. These reasons, coupled with several others, made staying in the Union a bad economic investment for the UK. A popular argument posed by economists in support of Brexit was over the UK's contribution to the EU fund and how the rebate didn't make up for the money the UK placed in. Now, this disparity was explained away with the benefits offered by the EU, namely entry into the single market. However, Bootle, Minford, and the remaining 6 economists argued that it wasn't worth the money the UK was pouring into the UK. Their argument was that the single market provided one advantage, and it wasn't as if other countries outside of Europe weren't making use of the single market either. To take things forward a little, during the transitional period from 2020 to 2021, the UK and the EU held negotiations on a trade agreement. This was to offset the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. The EU needed the UK's cooperation as one of the largest economies in the world. Consequently, the UK needed the EU as its largest trading partner. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement arose as a direct result of the negotiations. However, it's worth noting that David Frost, Boris Johnson's appointed negotiator, stated that the UK would only sign a deal that was entirely similar to the one the UK had with Canada. Some argued that poor EU decisions are more than made up for by the benefits of the single market, as if it was a door that could be opened or closed depending on EU membership status. The reality was that many countries would sell into the single market without membership. For example, the US was the largest exporter to the EU. Only 12% of the UK's GDP is accounted for by exports to the EU. but all of the UK economy remains subject to its regulations. This, combined with the fact that the benefits of the single market meant that the EU is a club of which the UK should not want to retain membership, according to the economists for Brexit. And now, to answer the question on everyone's minds, did Brexit worsen the UK's economy? Yes. Per the Aston report, the UK's economy was stiffed in a post-Brexit market because of the inefficiency of the trade and cooperation agreement and the red tape placed on Brexit goods. To preface, not every sector suffered as a consequence of Brexit, namely the tobacco industry and the railway sector benefited in the aftermath. That being said, between 2021 and 2023, the study calculated that UK goods exports to the EU were down 27% and imported goods were 32% lower than where they would have been had Brexit not happened. 2023 was the worst year so far, per the report. In the immediate consequence to increased custom clearances and declarations, many UK businesses opted for either one of three options: continue trade and bear the increased costs, lowering total gross profit, bearing a loss for some time as well. Second, shift business headquarters elsewhere, which in this case would be in one of the EU 27 nations. Lastly, close down trade outside of the UK altogether. Larger corporations could bear the cost, including the cost of relocating. Smaller businesses, particularly those that were accustomed to sending goods via Royal Mail to other nations, had more difficult choices to make. Likewise, leaving Brexit did not create more jobs with higher salaries for the people of the UK, contradictory to what the economists for Brexit had claimed. To better understand that aspect, however, we'd have to dive in deeper into free movement. Why should the UK leave the EU? If you were to ask the average Leave supporter or campaigner back in 2016, they'd answer, why not? Digging deeper, you'd realise that Euroscepticism had become so incredibly prevalent in the United Kingdom alongside other nations because of the EU's instability during that era that truly, why not? This argument was more than enough to substantiate their decision to vote to leave the EU on the day of the referendum. However, removing the ambiguities here, the EU allowed for several benefits that could be seen as restrictions for people living in Western Europe. You have to understand that while Europe in itself is one of the richest continents in the world, there's a strong disparity and disconnect between people living in the West and the East. To the west, we have the UK alongside several nations that have stronger economies. To the east, we have Poland, Romania and Bulgaria alongside several Eastern European nations with comparatively weaker economies. Now, is this disparity because of Western influence or the fact that many Eastern European nations remained a part of the former Soviet Union, which slated any form of progress? We'll leave that up to you to decide. In any case, one of the perks of being a member state was that you could travel freely from one nation to another. Broadly, the single market could also be considered a perk of freedom of movement. Freedom of movement of goods and services, that is. In effect, the EU 27, then the EU 28, operated as a single unit, and EU integration was a real thing. Speaking of which, the UK had always had disagreements with more pro-EU integration states such as France over its resistance. The rest of the EU states had adopted the euro, and the UK held firm on the pound. That's one example. In any case, coming back to freedom of movement, with every EU expansion, new states were added, and in 2004 and 2006, the EU accepted Poland, Bulgaria and Romania's membership into the Union, effectively bridging the distance between Eastern and Western Europe. But did the people of Western Europe want that? To give you a clearer picture here, the Polish diaspora is remarked as one of the largest diasporas seen anywhere in the globe. Essentially, this means that Poles tend to move out of Poland more readily than most nationalities. This is to find employment and search for a better quality of life, one that they couldn't find in Poland, at least not in the early 2000s. When Poland became a member of the EU, several Polish nationals flocked to the UK, alongside Germany, France and elsewhere in Western Europe, seeking those two things. In hindsight, when the economists for Brexit championed how how Brexit would lead to more jobs for the British, this is what they meant. By ending free movement, they could allow for more jobs for the people of Britain. These weren't new jobs, by the way. Withdrawing membership from the EU doesn't substantiate a new job market. These were the same jobs that Eastern European migrants took up, which would now be redistributed to the people of the United Kingdom. But freedom of movement isn't solely for people. Freedom of movement is composed of freedom of movement for goods, services, capital, and people. These freedoms are articulated in the EU's founding document, the Treaty of Rome, under Article 3. The activities of the community shall include the elimination, as between the member states, of customs duties and of quantitative restrictions on the import and export of goods, the abolition, as between the member states, of obstacles to freedom of movement for persons, services, and capital. As far as people were concerned, this meant that they could search for work in other EU states, work without requiring work permits, live there, and continue to live there, enjoying equal treatment with nationals in access to employment, working conditions, and all other social and tax advantages even after their employment ended. Immigration was a key issue for the Leave campaign, maybe even somewhat for the Remain group. Something to remember here is that despite being the one to sign off on the referendum, David Cameron was actually a part of the Remain group. He'd hoped that the people of the UK would vote to remain, but the narrow results would substantiate the UK's talks with the EU on renegotiations. Surely Cameron had a plan, although it didn't pan out the way he'd wanted it to. He recognised that immigration was becoming an issue for the everyday Brit and vowed to have a stern conversation with the EU on it. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party, as another example, was also largely in favour of remaining in the EU. However, the Labour Party also agreed that some changes were necessary. The UK's membership was a hotly contested topic, and altogether, the Remain group agreed that remaining in the Union should come with some stipulations and renegotiations on how things were to proceed from there on. Of course, the UK's ultimate decision to withdraw membership took Cameron's stern conversation off the table. Effectively, Cameron resigned shortly after the results were read. 1/3 of Leave voters said that their main reason for supporting Brexit was because it offered the best chance for the UK to regain control over immigration and its borders. In 2004, 10 new countries joined the European Union: Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Before this expansion, migration from the EU to the UK was modest and similar to the level seen in other EU countries. Even the poorer EU nations like Greece, Spain, and Portugal were receiving EU funding and saw minimal outmigration to the UK. This changed when the UK, along with Ireland and Sweden, decided not to restrict the movement of workers from these new EU member states. Many other EU countries, including Germany, Austria, France, and Italy, did impose temporary restrictions, mainly due to concerns about job competition and pressure from trade unions. Britain, however, chose not to follow suit. The ruling Labour government made this decision based on two assumptions: that other countries would open their labour markets as well, which would distribute migration more evenly, and that the decision was more of a geopolitical one rather than an immigration issue. When Britain finalised this decision in 2002, most EU countries were still debating their stance, with some economies facing high unemployment. As a result, Germany and Austria imposed a maximum 7-year restriction on workers from new EU countries, delaying their access to their labour markets until 2011. This left the UK as one of the few open destinations for workers from these new EU members, leading to a large influx of migrants to Britain. It's difficult to say if Britain would have seen fewer migrants had other EU countries opened their borders. However, it's reasonable to assume that some of the migration pressure on the UK might have been eased if other EU nations had been more welcoming at the time. We talked about free movement, particularly as it applied to people. At the time of the referendum, people within the UK believed that ending free movement would help improve the UK's overburdened immigration system. It goes without saying, actually, that the UK's immigration system is in fact quite overburdened, with many migrants choosing to relocate to the nation on an annual basis. However, you'd be surprised to know that immigration hasn't gotten lower. While fluctuations have existed throughout the years, the numbers don't reflect the ideal numbers that the Leave campaign had hoped to achieve. There are a few reasons for this. One would be the backlog of immigrants during the period when the world shut down. That spike in immigration can easily be explained as an unprecedented yet uncontrollable spike. COVID-19 happened. What was the world to do? That might be fair, but immigration numbers still haven't gone down. To rectify Blair's government's decisions, the 2024 Prime Minister, Labour Party's Sir Keir Starmer, has imposed the points-based system. Effectively, this would allow only skilled migrants into the country. The Labour Party is also working on imposing stricter immigration controls to battle immigration fraud and undocumented migrations. It's a work in progress, but do you know one facet of immigration that actually has gone down? That would be the number of British migrants. That is, ending free movement didn't just end free movement of Eastern Europeans to the United Kingdom. Effectively, it also ended the freedom of British immigrants to travel to other countries. British retirees were a significant group benefiting from free movement. Many chose to settle in warmer southern European countries, such as Spain or Portugal, where they enjoyed a lower cost of living, favourable climates, and vibrant expatriate communities. This access allowed retirees to have a higher quality of life and access to affordable healthcare under EU reciprocal healthcare agreements, which eased healthcare costs and planning. EU membership allowed British citizens unparalleled access to Europe, enhancing their educational, professional, and recreational experiences. This freedom enabled young people to study abroad more easily through programs like Erasmus, which fostered cultural exchange, language acquisition, and broader career perspectives. The ease of relocation for work also attracted many Britons, especially younger professionals, to European cities with thriving industries, such as Berlin's tech scene or Paris's finance sector. This movement was advantageous for personal growth, professional networks, and higher salaries in fields where demand was strong. Was leaving the EU necessary? Can the move still be rectified? Do the people of the UK even want it to be rectified? Will the EU ever allow the UK back in? A lot of questions to be answered.